As for the horrible incidents inside the church, we turn now to an expert from the Cult Education Institute in New Jersey. It's Rick Ross. Rick, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Good morning, Rick.
As you and I were speaking about this over the weekend, you were asking me some details about the church and its parishioners. From what we understand, Rick, the square footage of the church, Sam, is what?
According to some real estate websites, it's around 39,000 square feet because it's about 3 floors and it has a basement. It's an old school, really, in the area.
Right. And then as for the amount of parishioners there, maybe only about 30 or so. Does that strike you as being odd, that there are so few parishioners there? What could they stand to gain by having such a small following? What would be their ultimate goals in a situation like this?
Well, from what I understand from news reports and from former members speaking out, the group was substantially larger. And then when Jerry Irwin came back, who was the original founder of the organization, he became much more authoritarian with his wife, Tracy Irwin. And so the group diminished, and many people left or they were asked to leave. And so now what you have is really a hardcore following, largely 5 families who are essentially, according to reports, ruled over by Tracy Irwin, who is Jerry Irwin's widow.
Interesting, too. We use the word cult. That was the word that was being used on the front page of our newspaper here, the OD, the Observer Dispatch, asking the question, is it a cult? Is it a cult, Rick, in your opinion?
Well, there are 3 primary characteristics that I would say form the nucleus for a definition of a destructive cult. One is an absolute authoritarian leader who becomes the defining element and driving force of the group and who has no accountability. And that would seem to fit this group. The second would be that people are so isolated and controlled, their communication, their association with the outside world, that they come under undue influence through a form of coercive persuasion. And that also seems to be the case with this group. And then finally, that the group does harm. Now we know that is certainly true. So I think, in my opinion, this group fits all 3 of the primary characteristics to determine a destructive cult.
You were also telling me over the weekend that this type of activity has proliferated in New York State in particular. Why was that?
Well, there are parts of upstate New York, as you well know, and as this old schoolhouse building, 39,000 square feet for an appraised value of about $200,000. Then you are a 501c3, which means you're a nonprofit, religious tax-exempted organization, and you pay no property tax. So that's very luring. A lot of square footage, a lot of land for a little money, and then you take yourself off the tax rolls. There's an organization quite controversial called Dawn Yoga, led by a Korean Grand Master by the name of Il-Chi Lee. He now controls the Honors Haven Resort and Spa, which is located in Ellenville, New York. There are other groups that have moved in to similar areas in New York because they can pick up old properties for very little money and then move their group in, and they can either create a compound, a school, a retreat, or a meeting place with very low overhead. Now,
Ellenville, where is that in the Catskills?
Yes, Ellenville, I believe, is it's in the Shawangunk mountain range in the foothills. The group picked up 200 acres and a resort, and it's quite beautiful. And it's located in Ellenville, New York. And this group has often been called a cult, and the founder is from South Korea. It's called Dawn Yoga.
Are there violent acts that occur at this particular compound, or are they protected somewhat in their privacy and that some of that stuff might be going on, but we just don't know?
Well, let's keep in mind that the destructiveness of groups called cults varies by degree. So not all groups are equally destructive. In the case of Dawn Yoga, there was a death of a woman who was on a retreat in Sedona, Arizona. she died from dehydration in a group activity. She was from New York. She was a professor at a college in Queens, but she was at a retreat in Sedona, Arizona, and she died there, and there was litigation. So this group does have a death associated with the group. I've received many complaints about the group, but are they as violent as the Word of Life Christian Church has been discovered to be? No. There certainly have not been breaking sessions called confessionals in the Honors Haven Resort and Spa. This group is more focused on making money, and it's quite controversial, and it has been called a cult, and it's an example of a group picking up relatively inexpensive real estate in upstate New York and taking it over as a hub of group activity.
Talking to Rick Ross from the Cult Education Institute here on the Talk of the Town, 100.7 FM WUTQ. And when you talk about making money as being one of the business ventures of these cults, you were referring yesterday or over the weekend with me with a phrase, you used the word affinity. What was that? Explain that again.
Well, this is a form of fraud. It's called affinity fraud, and it's when someone, I'll give you an example. Bernie Madoff is Jewish. Many of the victims of Bernie Madoff, who ran the most infamous Ponzi scheme in the history of the United States and involved billions of dollars, were Jews, like Bernie Madoff. So he used the affinity, the friendship, the common ground of being Jewish to insinuate himself as a financial advisor for Jewish charities like Yeshiva University, the nonprofit established by the Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, and in the end, of course, he was a thief and he's now in prison. But it was the affinity fraud aspect of his Ponzi scheme that is targeting people within the Jewish community, which he did. And this has been done in the Mormon community, and it's been done within the evangelical community. That is, someone with a Ponzi scheme, a fraudulent scheme, comes into a church or an organization and develops friendships with the purpose of committing fraud.
Gotcha.
Quick question. If this does become, people now understand this Word of Life as to be a cult, and in the past, because, a crime has been committed, does it get disbanded by law? And what will stop the leaders from creating another cult-like church in another community? Is there a way to stop that?
We live in a country with the First Amendment of the Constitution, which draws a sharp line between religious groups and the government. So they have quite a bit of insulation. So far, the Irwins have not come to the courthouse, other than one member of their family testifying against the Leonards the other day. As far as Tracy Irwin and her daughter coming into this situation and being charged, the police say there may be other charges, but they haven't talked about the Tracy Irwin. And many times what happens in groups like this is followers commit crimes, but the leader is not directly involved and therefore not charged. An exception to that would be Charles Manson. Charles Manson was not at the scene of any of the murders, the Tate LaBianca murders, and yet he was charged, convicted, and imprisoned as the mastermind behind the murders. So the question is, what will the New Hartford Police Force do? Will they move on the Irwins? Do the Irwins play a role in this? Did they mandate this type of behavior in some way? Were they associated with it? I followed the testimony of one of the one of the Irwin children, and he seemed to act during his testimony in court as if this was no big deal. He saw one of the Leonard children bleeding. He knew that there was something going on, but he didn't really do anything. He didn't call police. He didn't try to rescue the young man. So you wonder how often did this type of thing go on in the building?
And Rick, in your experience, following cults and looking at information regarding cults, a congregation like this, how long is the time frame to someone getting involved? Is this overnight? Does it take 2 weeks? Does it take a month? And then with that, how is it for them to draw in others? Family members, friends. What is the connection?
Well, you've hit on it. I mean, there are children that were literally born into this group who had no choice but to be in it. There are others, as has been described by reports, that they are an interlocking group of families, about 5 families primarily, one being the Leonards, that they bring in relations, that they bring in friends, that there are quite a few members that have been in this group for more than a decade. There have been people that have left in recent years that have been in for more than a decade. But this group, this is a very, very controlling group, a very extreme group from what I have read, because they would monitor phone calls. They would dictate who you could talk to. They would shun people if they were not in favor with the Irwins. And I would regard this counseling session to me as a breaking session. And this was a young man who, according to police, was considering leaving the group, which tells me that in this group there is no legitimate reason to leave. And if you leave the group, you are damned, you are wrong, you are a pariah. And so this is a very authoritarian, very controlling group. And I really look to the authorities and this thing to play out, where we'll find more and more out about the Irwins and their control. According to one report, there are 4 officers of the corporation that controls the assets of the Word of Life Christian Church. We know that Bruce Leonard, who's charged in this manslaughter case, was a trustee. But who are the 4 officers, and who really controls the property, the money of this organization?
Interesting, yes. If we can, and we're talking to Rick Ross from the Cult Education Institute here on the Talk of the Town, 100.7 FM WUTQ. I'd like to play a clip of an interview that you tipped me off on about Anderson Cooper's show on CNN with Anderson Cooper 360 and a guy named Chadwick Hanville, who was describing some of the controlling activity that you're referring to, Rick. Here's part of that clip. Check it out.
You were sometimes embarrassed publicly or shunned in some way. Other times you weren't. There was one particular family that I thought was always targeted, was Bruce and Debbie Leonard. I know they did a heinous act and a despicable, horrible crime, and they need to be accountable for that. But they also, too, were victims.
How about that? He's saying that they were victimized as well. Was that surprising to you?
No, not at all. There have been other cases like this. There was a case in Attleboro, Massachusetts, with a group called The Body, where a child was starved to death. There was another case in Philadelphia, a group called One Mind Ministries, where a child was abused and starved to death. And in those cases, the mothers were initially charged. In the case in One Mind Ministries, the mother was given leniency, and the leader, a woman who went by the name of Queen Antoinette, was prosecuted and is now in prison. In the Attleboro group, the leader's son was prosecuted and sent to prison, and the mother was given leniency. So in some of these groups, terrible things go on. In both groups, people were shunned, people were humiliated, and the mothers were coerced to abuse their own children in the name of God, in the name of the church. I talk about these cases in my book, Cults Inside Out, which is a compendium of information about cults. And there's a chapter within the book titled Small But Deadly that talks about these very small groups of less than 100 in which there have been terrible tragedies. And we never find out about these groups until something awful like what happened in New Hartford happens.
Very interesting. We're talking with Rick Ross. The book is called Cults Inside Out, and his organization is Cult Education Institute.
And Rick, in your conclusion, all being said and done, is this conducive to a cult?
Yeah, I absolutely think that this group represents, in my opinion, a destructive cult, and it was flying under the radar for the authorities. They had no idea what was really going on in that building. The Irwins apparently lived there. They raised dogs there. Other members lived there. It was, if you will, a kind of cult compound right in the heart of town.
Yeah.
And no one really understood it. There were neighbors who thought it was odd. I think local religious leaders, the priests nearby, thought something is terribly wrong there. But until this tragedy, no one really was in a position to take action. And that reflects the kind of protection that religious groups have. Though I would point out that not all groups called cults are religious, and they can often be a therapy group, a political group, a martial arts group, a yoga group, a meditation group. But when you claim to be a religion and invoke tax-exempt status, the authorities become much more reluctant to move in.
What's going on inside that building right now, would you think? I know that there's a sign on the outside saying that they're closed to the public in their period of mourning, but that doesn't preclude them from having private meetings on the inside. What do you think's going on?
Well, I think that the Irwins continue to control the group. They have for some time, and that the members in the group do not communicate or communicate very little with the outside world from all accounts. I mean, they were literally told, you must ask permission, according to reports, who you call on the phone. And one neighbor said that there was no communication with them at all. Mm-hmm. So this is a group of people that live in a kind of bubble inside that 39,000 square foot old school building. That is their world. Some of them have houses outside of the building, but they report into the building, and this is their life. And so in that world that is controlled by the leader, they have a very false sense of reality. They have no outside feedback. They have no alternative perspectives. And what their leader says is true, and how that leader interprets reality is what they believe reality to be. And it's a very odd kind of existence.
Sure. And finally, briefly, if you would, Rick, what do you expect would happen in the outcome of this case, and what would you expect would become of the Irwins?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the Irwins I think the Irwins control the assets of the group. Mm-hmm. To what extent there may be litigation against the organization by the surviving Leonard Child, and to what extent authorities may pursue the Irwins themselves, eventually bringing them before the court and charging them, that remains to be seen. But this could be the beginning of the end for the Word of Life Christian Church.
Right.
And folks just out in the community that living amongst something like this, are there some telltale signs that they can be aware of?
Yes, when you have a group that claims to be a church, but they have no interaction with the rest of the religious community, they're isolated, their members and children don't associate with anyone else, and you begin to see that a charismatic leader is a dictator in a totalitarian sense over the group, and that people are constantly in the group asking for permission about what to do from that leader. And you sense this total isolation, this lack of interaction. That would be certainly some signs that this particular group is different, and different in a way that might put it into the category of a destructive cult.
Rick, fascinating perspectives. Thanks for the insights today. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.